Hello, my name is Nicole Bousema, and this is my talk on 5G and why we need to be concerned. But before I begin, I want to give a background about me. I'm a building biologist, which essentially means I go into people's homes to see if there are hazards that are impacting their health. I also created the building biology industry in Australia when I established the Australian College of Environmental Studies in 1999, which educates people about the hazards in their home, from mould and allergens like dust mite to toxicants like flame retardants, pesticides and chemicals in everyday products, and of course the impact of wireless technology on sleep and other human health issues. But that all pales into insignificance compared to the rollout of 5G. The fifth generation is the next step in the evolution of mobile wireless communication technology, which promises better connectivity, more reliability, much faster networks and bandwidths, and of course low latency. After all, who wouldn't want to download 600 feature films per minute? It will also provide the infrastructure for the fourth industrial revolution by creating autonomy in manufacturing, driverless cars, and of course the birth of artificial intelligence. By 2025, a third of the world's population will be exposed to the radiation for 5G, and the Australian government is on track to expose 99% of the Australian population to have access to this technology. So let's go back. 5G uses very high millimetre wave radiation, which was developed by the military as a weapon and still used for crowd control. In order to deploy this infrastructure, because the waves are very short, it needs 20,000 satellites in the ionosphere, which means that we don't know its impact on the Schumann resonance and the terrestrial radiation that we've evolved on. That's rule number one, big problem. The second thing is it requires millions and millions of small cell antennas that are deployed every 50 to 250 metres from your home that are beaming radiation directly to your smart devices and of course your cell phone. These small cells transmit direct beams of energy referred to as MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. The cell towers will have thousands of antennas that will have an effect radiated power of 100,000 watts. And of course that is really significant compared to the radiation that I'm going to talk about on exposure standards later in this talk. It'll be aimed at you and everyone else using a cell phone and smart appliances. Any insect that passes the beam will resonate, especially if it's millimetre in diameter, will resonate at the same frequency and it will kill them instantly, which is a real concern in light of the fact that there's been a 70% reduction in insects and bees on the planet as a result of pesticides. So the impact on insects in our food line essentially is unknown. Cells will be fitted with, to existing infrastructure, including street lights, power lines, tram poles, bus stops, railway stations, advertising panels, and even inside residential and office buildings. The concerns are health. Because there's been very little data on the impact of this high frequency radiation on human health, the industry say there's not enough data. Well, they should actually provide the data to prove it's safe, but unfortunately that's not how capitalist societies work. However, we do know that there's a lot of evidence to indicate that it can cause cataracts, and that since the 1960s there's been a lot of studies on rodents and humans to show that high frequency radiation causes cataracts, which we know is the number one cause of blindness. It also affects the skin, and what's more of a concern is the fact that our sweat ducts act as helical antennas, which means it affects them, which is closely aligned with the sympathetic nervous system and our immune system. There's a big issue about privacy and security as a result of hackers being able to access this and access everything within our home in terms of our appliances, because millions of devices are going to have microchips and antennas, which means that they can communicate wirelessly with one another. Even our nappies will contain these devices, apparently. Interference is a big problem with the 5G network, so we don't even know if it's going to be accurate or be able to do what they're promising that it will do. And of course, the e-waste, the electronic waste of these toxic metals and emissions is unknown. So let's go back to why wireless technologies, we need to be concerned. There are difficulties in doing research on electromagnetic fields. The first of these is that collecting reliable data on complex and rapidly changing patterns of exposure whilst minimising recall bias and errors is a significant challenge for looking at the research on electromagnetic fields. The exposure is imperceptible. You don't see it, you don't smell it, you don't hear it, you don't taste it. So therefore, and it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. With 5G, it means every part of this planet is going to be exposed to this high frequency radiation. So as a researcher, how on earth can we assess its impact when there's no control? There won't be a place on the planet that isn't affected by it in some way. It varies greatly over time and distance, and there are very few studies that consider the first age of exposure. What that means is we have this generation growing up from the cradle to the grave who will be exposed from the moment they are conceived to the time they die. That has never happened in the evolution of mankind, which is why we urgently need research to see what impact that has on this generation before it's actually launched across the entire planet. But of course, capitalist society means dividends for shareholders. They will release it. They don't have to prove it's safe. So it spends time with researchers like me. I'm currently doing my PhD on the impact of wireless technology on brain and sleep function. The onus is on people like me to prove it's dangerous, like we did with asbestos, environmental tobacco smoke, leaded petrol, etc. That is not good enough. Personal exposure data is virtually non-existent in most studies. The other difficulties in researching electromagnetic fields is that there are long latency periods. Now, we know that these brain tumours when using cell phones take 15 to 25 years. We're only reaching that peak now in human history. So to make a call that it doesn't cause gliomas and acoustic neuromas is ridiculous because it takes time, just as we found with asbestos. What is of real concern is that the Germans in 2016 translated the research, 3 decades of research from the Russians. Now, in Russia, they are required to do health studies of anyone that is involved in careers involving electromagnetic field exposures. And what they found over between 1960 and 1997 is that people who were exposed for 2 hours or more per day to electromagnetic field devices had a significant increase in their development of symptoms, which we now know are electromagnetic sensitivities. People who were exposed to digital devices for 20 minutes or less per day had no impact, but those who had 2 hours or more had significant impacts on their health after 5 to 10 years. Now that's really important to know, and I'll explain what those symptoms are shortly. It's interesting that the telecommunications fund studies that are short-term studies, which means we only look at over minutes or days, over a short time, not over years, which is what the Russian research is indicating is when it becomes harmful. Now, most studies funded by the telecommunications favour short-term studies. We call them provocation studies. They're often done by researchers or psychologists to prove that electromagnetic sensitivity doesn't exist. We know they're completely false for many reasons, including the fact that when people are exposed, there's a washout period before their symptoms develop because of the histamine response, very similar to what we find with patients with allergies. So what I wanted to do is give you a quiz to educate you as to key things you need to know as the public to make informed choices about the technology you use. The first of those is, which electromagnetic fields are we exposed to in the home? Electric fields, which are created from voltage, magnetic field, which is created from current or the movement of electrons. Magnetic fields are created when an appliance is in use, such as when the light is heating, when the electric blanket is heating, for example, when your computer is on, so to speak, when the oven is heating. Radio frequencies used in all your wireless devices, baby monitors, cordless phones, cell phones, smart meters, for example. And dirty power, which is high frequency spikes, which occur with a lot of inverters from solar panels. And of course, many of your smart devices create huge amounts of dirty power, which ride on your building wiring and through your appliances. And the answer to that is all of the above. All of the above fields are found in your house as we speak. Which electromagnetic fields were classified as possibly carcinogenic to humans by the International Agency for Research on Cancer? Was it electric fields, magnetic fields, radio frequencies? Well, it was both magnetic fields and radio frequencies. which is a concern because, of course, they're in your home. Now, there's a lot of data on the impact of radiation on cancer with radio frequencies used in wireless technology. We know that there's very strong correlations to cell phone use and, of course, brain tumours. If you use your cell phone next to your head for a minimum of, 30 minutes a day for 5 to 10 years, your incidence of brain tumours escalates significantly, more than double. That's well established in the scientific literature, and Professor Leonard Hardell was the key researcher who was indicating and raised his concerns about this for at least 2 decades now. We know magnetic fields also is associated with childhood leukemia, and that first came out in 1979 by 2 researchers, Wertheimer and Leeper, who were investigating childhood leukemia and proximity to high voltage transmission lines. In short, children who were exposed to 4 milligauss of magnetic fields or higher had a doubling the incidence of childhood leukemia if they were raised in the first 15 years of their life to these high voltage transmission lines. As a result of this and several other systematic reviews that came around by Album and Greenland in early 2000s, in 2002 the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified magnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. In May 2011, the radiation emitted from cell phones and all your wireless devices were classified as possibly carcinogenic to humans as a result of the fact they could no longer ignore the weight of evidence associating adverse health effects with this wireless technology. And here's the first study by Wertheimer and Leeper. Many studies, as you can see from the slides, many studies correlating cancer with electromagnetic fields. Another slide, lots and lots of studies. But the big ones that came out recently were the animal rodent studies. The National Toxicology Program spent $25 million studying thousands of rats to see if there were connections between cell phone use or exposure to radiation, radio frequency radiation used in all your wireless devices, and cancer. And it was designed to prove that there wasn't a connection. Well, what the researchers found is that there was a strong correlation between exposures to radio frequencies, normally found in your wireless devices, and cancers in rodents. And in fact, they published their study early because of concerns raised by the researchers about this. This was shortly followed by the Ramazzini Institute in Italy that also showed statistically significant increase in incidence of cancers in male rats as a result of their exposures to the radiation emitted from wireless devices. So which country removed wireless technology from kindergartens and schools? Well, it actually was Cyprus and France that did this as a result of concerns from the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So in Australia, the regulatory organisations that are involved in regulating electromagnetic fields are ARPANSA, the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency. They set safety standards for exposure to radiation, to both ionising radiation from X-rays, for example, and of course non-ionising radiation. The devices that emit the radiation are actually regulated by the Australian Communications and Media Authority. ARPANSA's exposure standards are based on, now which one do you think this is? Long-term exposure to low levels, like what you find in everyday in your homes, your cell phones and wireless technology? Or are ARPANSA standards, who regulate this, heating of tissue over 6 minutes? Or are they designed to protect Australians from exposures to a known radiation or a possibly carcinogenic technology? Or are they studies demonstrating biological effects at non-thermal exposures, or all of the above? They'd be probably shocked to know that ARPANSA only developed their exposure standards based on heating of tissue over 6 minutes. And this was developed by the International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation in the late 1990s. They modelled it off a 220-pound US military soldier in the 5th percentile, i.e. someone that you generally don't find in the general population. And what they did is they exposed this 220-pound US military person, who represents virtually no one in the population, to a cell phone until such time that it heated their head. Now they have a mannequin to replicate that. That is completely inadequate, and it's only over 6-minute increments. What I'm saying is that the exposure standard that ARPANSA have are not based on long-term exposures to low levels typically found in your home or anywhere else in this country or any Western country. Our PANZA safety standards are derived actually from the International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, and these are only based on acute short-term effects of heating of tissue, and in the case of magnetic fields, inducing electric currents. So the point of being exposed until you actually induce currents in your body or that your body heats up. Even by ICNIRP's own admission in 2002, children, the elderly and the immunocompromised might have a low tolerance for exposures to this non-ionising radiation, and it may be more effective to adjust the guidelines for the general population to include such groups. However, that has never occurred. So our PANZA are based on ICNIRP standards, which themselves acknowledge that there needs to be lower standards for people who are vulnerable. But nothing has been done about it since the 1990s. Now, if you actually look at ICNIRP, there's quite an interesting that's going on. It's a closed organisation of private individuals, most of whom have been funded by the telecommunications industry, most of whom have published research that shows no effect, as opposed to non-industry funded research, which shows 70% of the time that there is an adverse health effect associated with wireless technology exposures. So most of the experts in ICNIRP are actually engineers, and there's only one that is involved in medicine who has not published anything on radio frequency exposures, which is interesting. Now, according to Dr. Ron Melnick, who was one of the lead scientists involved in the $25 million study, it was the most expensive study ever done on the impact of wireless technology and radio frequencies on rodents. And according to him, the P in ICNIRP stands for protection. One must wonder who this commission is trying to protect, because evidently it's not public health, in light of the fact that this research, and there's hundreds of studies, thousands of studies showing biological effects at non-thermal levels, i.e. you don't have to heat the body before you have significant health effects, as I'll explain. The exposure standards, just to give you an idea of what the exposure standards are throughout the world, Australia, the UK and the US have the worst standards. They expose their populations to very high levels of radiation, as opposed to most Asian countries, which are 100 times lower than what you're allowed to be exposed to in Australia. So you can see the rundown here on those exposure standards. Just to give you an idea, in Salzburg, Austria, the level of radiation permitted from their cell phone tower is 1 million times lower than what's allowed from a cell phone tower in Australia. It's just shocking. The exposure standards for magnetic fields are also really poor. In the building biology standards, we do not allow more than 2 milligauss maximum for a living space and 0.2 milligauss for a bedroom. Why? Because a childhood leukemia study by Wertheim and Leeper showed conclusively that children exposed to 4 milligauss or higher in terms of current had a doubling the incidence of childhood leukemia. And yet look at our PANZA standards, it allows 2,000 milligauss. Now remember, these exposure standards are developed in compromise with industry to determine what's practicable in a workplace. They are not designed for people who are uniquely exposed during critical windows of development, like children, the immunocompromised, etc. Our PANZA has a memoranda of understanding with the Australian Communications Media Authority. And ACMA, of course, refers to safety standards and guidelines developed by our PANZA, which in turn were developed by ICNIRP, who in turn acknowledge that they're not adequate for people who are susceptible, and they're only for thermal effects in 6-minute increments. ACMA selected the standard that was least protective for health, and it has a major conflict with the telecommunications industry. Why? Because our PANZA receives funding from ACMA, which in turn receives $1 million levy every year from the wireless industry to investigate the health impacts of radio frequency radiation. ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, received billions of dollars from the wireless industry every year as a result of spectrum sales. Now, we know corporate corruption is rife when it comes to asbestos, tobacco smoke, etc. We call it the fourth dog defence. And in chapter 1 of my book, I go into detail about how industry keeps toxic products on the market in order to make billions of dollars at the cost of human health. Strongly suggested, don't take my word for granted, have a look at the research on this. The first of those corporate ties that bind in 2017 that was published, and there's a chapter on how Australia sets its exposure standards for electromagnetic fields. A lot of that came from Don Maish's work. He did his PhD on the Procrustean approach. Fabulous reading. It reads like a Bollywood film, how the exposure standards in Australia were developed. CSIRO developed a radio frequency band full of electrical engineers in order to establish what impact wireless technology would have on the Australian public in the 1990s. In 1994, that was published as the Barnett Report. It was made not available for public review because it was funded by Telecom, Vodafone and Optus, because the electrical engineers voiced their concerns about exposure to children to the wireless technology. As a result of this, within a few years, these electrical engineers were made redundant and the radio frequency division of the CSIRO was then disbanded. And it then was up to the NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, to establish this. They then, at the moment, we have the telecommunications providing funding for a lot of this, and the head researcher is a psychologist who's doing provocation studies, which we've shown to be completely inadequate. Highly recommended you read this information. The exposure standards have no scientific basis because they're based on 6-minute exposures for heating effects like a microwave oven. They assume the only way electromagnetic fields can cause ill health is to heat tissue or induce electrical currents in the body. That is completely false. In fact, according to Professor Martin Paul, who is the lead researcher who discovered the way in which electromagnetic fields may affect the body at a cellular level, he said it contradicts thousands of peer-reviewed studies and it fails to protect the health and the public, and it protects the economic interest of the telecommunications industry. ICNIRP contradicts doctors and researchers. There have been thousands of statements and produced by doctors all over the world and papers to show their concerns about our exposures to wireless technologies. They include the By Initiative report, highly well worth going onto their website, the European Electromagnetic Field Guidelines, which is a 35-page document on how to diagnose electrical sensitivity and treat it. The Austrian Medical Association in 2012 developed guidelines for all their doctors on how to diagnose electromagnetic sensitivity as a duty of care. And of course, the International Electromagnetic Field Scientist Appeal, involving over 230 scientists over 41 countries. Have a look at that website. And of course, there's a huge list of appeals and statements involving thousands of researchers that you can find on the website listed here. What's interesting is we know how wireless technologies impact the body at a cellular level. And the first of those is that it suppresses melatonin. The blue light emitted from digital devices and the LEDs that the government has forced you to have in your home has high levels of blue light, and this blue light suppresses melatonin. It's very important that you're not exposed to this blue light after dark because of the ability to suppress melatonin, which is the most important antioxidant, anti-cancer neurotransmitter that you have in your body. It makes turmeric look like it's not doing anything. So the quickest way to increase your risk for cancer is to suppress the hormone that mops up all the oxidative stress in your body, and that's melatonin. If you look at this book, I bought this book a few years ago, published in 2010, and it's a 400-page book on the function of melatonin on the body. It sets a circadian rhythm. When melatonin levels drop, that's when puberty starts. It has very strong correlations to fertility and, most importantly, to sleep and your circadian rhythm, and of course affects almost every system in the body, especially the immune response. As a result, it's oncostatic. It means it prevents cancer. So when you expose yourself to blue light and to man-made electromagnetic fields, you're actually suppressing the most important neurotransmitter that prevents cancer in the body. This is why it's so important to reduce your exposures, especially at night time, to make sure you're not exposed to this. The second way in which electromagnetic fields are known to affect the body at a cellular level is that it acts on voltage-gated calcium channels, and this is the work conducted by Professor Martin Paul. These voltage-gated calcium channels are primarily found in our heart, the testicles, and of course the central nervous system, which is coincidentally where most of the symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity begin. Now we know when you create this influx of calcium ions, it results in multiple downstream effects. Ultimately, what that means is it creates oxidative stress. Now, the interesting thing about oxidative stress is that it's closely associated with inflammation. As you increase oxidative stress, you increase systemic inflammation. And what's interesting about that is that's what causes aging. Oxidative stress, inflammation. That's what causes almost every chronic illness is associated with oxidative stress and inflammation. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the two are linked and that the incidence of many of these chronic illnesses and cancer risks have increased significantly since the introduction of 2G and many of these man-made electromagnetic fields. There's a lot of research on the impact of voltage-gated calcium channel, but I think the most important of these is the fact that many of the symptoms can be inhibited or stopped by using calcium channel blocker drugs. When the drugs are used in rodents, the symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity disappear. So oxidative stress, 89% of the 242 studies identified oxidative stress following exposures to electromagnetic fields according to the AUSA database. AUSA is an amazing group of Australian researchers who have one of the largest databases on electromagnetic field studies and have looked at if they're industry funded or independent and whether they show biological effects or not. Well worth going to their website. Lots of data on oxidative stress, as you can see here. Here are just some of the studies that you can find on my website. Now, when you cause oxidative stress, you affect the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, but more importantly, you affect the DNA. By causing single and double-strand DNA breaks, what you're doing is increasing your risk for cancers, and there's been quite a lot of studies on this alone, as you can see here. That affects both the hormones, and especially it affects fertility and male fertility especially. So it's very important you don't have these wireless devices on your person. The third way in which electromagnetic fields may impact human health is that it enhances the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Now this is really significant because by doing this, it allows the influx of other toxicants, such as chemicals already in your body like pesticides and flame retardants and persistent organic pollutants, but of course things like mold and biotoxins as well. This hypothesis is that it may create the synergistic effect. Electromagnetic fields may very well be the worst impact on EMFs may well be to enhance the impact of chemicals already in your body and of course dampness, which is a real problem. And the reason why I say that is because the symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity are almost identical to multiple chemical sensitivity and almost identical to mold illnesses. Why? They're probably the same illness. We refer to them as chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So by enhancing the permeability of the brain to all the chemicals and mold spores that you may have in your body, because we know dampness affects more than 50% of the housing in most Western countries, it accelerates their influx into the cell and through the central nervous system. Electromagnetic fields are associated with a myriad of neuropsychiatric effects because of its impact on melatonin, because of its increase in oxidative stress, especially in the central nervous system. Depression and anxiety and brain fog are very commonly associated with electromagnetic sensitivities, including losing words mid-sentence, becoming dyslexic. The amount of adults that I've found who are electrically sensitive become dyslexic as they're exposed to these electromagnetic fields is enormous. So let's go through the symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity. The first is headache. Children who get headaches, especially in the afternoon at schools, if it's not due to hypoglycemia and low blood sugar, I always suspect and have a look at their exposures to radio frequencies. Where is the router in their school? Where is the router in their home? And any other wireless devices in their bedrooms is a big no, obviously. Sleep disturbances. People exposed to these routers, especially if they're on their desk and they're within the near field, which means 4 wavelengths from that RF source, are much higher risk of exposure or developing electromagnetic sensitivities. So sleep disturbances, can't get to sleep at night, keep waking up, have to sleep during the day, and then it completely affects their circadian rhythm. And of course fatigue, because they're not sleeping well, they end up with long-term fatigue, which is often misdiagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome. About 50% of the patients with electromagnetic sensitivity will have electric shocks, often because antidiuretic hormone is affected and they cannot keep urine in the body, so they're constantly urinating, which means that their electrolytes on their skin increase, so when they touch things they get these shocks. They often have excessive thirst, but when the doctor looks at testing them, they're not diabetic, so that's often key symptoms associated with both mold and electromagnetic sensitivities. Heart-related issues, as I mentioned, voltage-gated calcium channels are high within the heart, so they often have high or low blood pressure, they often have high or low heart rate, they often can get what we call postural orthostatic tachycardia, so they get up and they feel quite dizzy and their heart starts speeding. They can often have palpitations and chest constrictions as well. Dizziness, very common. Balance-related issues. I've had a few clients who've had many ears syndrome that reduce significantly when they're away from wireless devices. Short-term memory loss, anomia, missing words mid-sentence because they forget, oh, that's a cup of water, and they forget what it's called. Difficulty learning, and of course dyslexia in adults. I always think of checking electromagnetic field exposures. Tinnitus, ringing in the ears, can also occur. Of course, there are many reasons why people can get tinnitus. This is one of them. Some people get these dry, gritty eyes, and of course others get this burning redness, shock sensation along or tingling along their skin. And others get fibromyalgic type of symptoms like numbness and weakness. They're often sensitive to chemicals, light, noise and smell, very, very commonly. And it's often because the myelin sheath has been stripped from their central nervous system, which makes them hypersensitive to the other senses. Who was diagnosed with electromagnetic hypersensitivity? Well, that was Nikola Tesla. He had classic symptoms of this, and Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the former director of the World Health Organization. She did not allow people to come into her office, apparently, if they had their cell phones on. Which country published guidelines on electromagnetic sensitivity as a duty of care? Well, as I mentioned, that was Austria. Very forward thinking of them. These are the guidelines produced by Austria, so you can access them. Very well worth reading. And of course, the French researchers, Professor Dominique Belpomme is the lead researcher on chronic fatigue syndrome in the world. Highly worth looking at this paper on the disease markers. Very useful to give to your doctor to educate them how to diagnose electromagnetic sensitivities and, more importantly, how to treat it. So this, along with the Austrian medical guidelines and the European guidelines, those three documents, give it to your doctor to educate them how to diagnose, that it is a serious illness, what biomarkers to use, and more importantly, how they can help and assist you with your condition. So the biomarkers are chronic inflammatory response, hyperhistamine, high levels of histamine in the body, high levels of peroxynitric free radicals, circulating autoantibodies to myelin, which is interesting because a lot of people can be misdiagnosed with MS, decrease in 24 urine for melatonin, and hyperperfusion in the capsulothalamic area of the brain, which of course is involved in memory. So who is susceptible? Well, first, long-term exposure of 5 years or more to low levels is exposed, which essentially means most of us. If you look at the latest Australian studies on the amount of time children are using on digital devices, we're talking in excess of 3 hours a day. That is a real problem because what we're finding is more than 2 hours a day from the Russian research significantly increases people's exposures after 5 to 10 years. Short-term exposure to high levels, like electrical workers, electricians, electrical engineers, etc., are highly susceptible to exposures to electromagnetic fields. Anyone who has metal in their body, titanium implants and surgical steel, that can set up a galvanic corrosion, that can also result in a battery effect, especially if there's a lot of metal in their mouth. If they've got a cell phone near, they can act as an antenna. That's a real problem because it could accelerate corrosion of those metals and increase their load, toxic metals within their body, but also can act as an antenna. Jaw, temporomandibular joint pain, etc. So very important that these patients are not exposed to any form of electromagnetic fields within their body. Unborn fetus children, even ICNIRP acknowledge, they have thinner skulls, high densities of stem cells, they have high extracellular water which acts to propagate electromagnetic fields, and of course they're exposed from the cradle to the grave, as opposed to my generation where we were only exposed in adulthood to these technology. Atopic constitutions, people who have a history of asthma and allergies seem to be more susceptible to environmental chemicals, allergens, electromagnetic fields, etc. So very important that they are more susceptible. And of course, multiple chemical sensitivities. So let's have a look at this. How do you know if you're exposed to high levels? So the first of these, are you involved in occupation where you're exposed to electromagnetic fields, like, say, for example, an electrician? How much time do you spend a day on your cell phone or cordless phone? If it's more than 30 minutes a day, that's a problem, because Professor Leonard Hardell's research showed within 10 years your incidence for cell phone tumours actually escalates by more than double. When making calls, you must always create a distance between your phone and your head. You don't want that antenna in the phone near your person. In fact, the telecommunications industry probably warn you all the time not to put it near your person. We refer to it as the fourth dog defence. I warned you not to use my product by giving you these constant reminders, don't put it near your person. It's interesting that telecommunications cannot get funding from the largest insurance companies in the world, the underwriters, which is Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re. They refuse to insure the telecommunications industry. Wonder why. So make sure if you're going to use a cell phone, I use my cell phone, I don't ever put it near my head. I use an earpiece, or I text, or I use a loudspeaker and put it on a desk as I'm talking to the client. Very important. Of course, always make sure you use it with your cell phone, that it has the maximum amount of bars, not in a low signal strength area. Otherwise, the power output, the strength of the radiation increases significantly. How much time do you spend on a digital device? Well, the less the better. Very important, no more than 20 minutes a day according to the Russian research. Do you live in a double-storey home? Can you see line of sight? If you're a second or third story and you can see a cell phone base station in line of sight, I can tell you now that the levels are going to be elevated much higher than the building biology standard of 10 microwatts per square metre. So that's the first thing I will educate the doctors about this, that ask their patients if they can see a cell phone tower within 400 metres in direct line of sight, that's already going to be elevated. That's a problem and it needs to be addressed, either by shielding thick metal blinds or something like that, or shielded curtains will probably be warranted, or relocate rooms to an area where you don't have line of sight. To locate the cell towers and the 5G infrastructure throughout Australia, here are some websites. Download the AusPhone Towers app. Also go to the RFNSA website, and of course there's 3 other websites there. So have a look there to actually identify where the cell phone towers are, whether the 5G network has already been rolled out in your area. Do you have wireless devices in rooms where you spend time? You should not have wireless devices anywhere in your bedroom, because it pumps out radio frequencies 24 hours a day. Why is that a problem? Because it suppresses melatonin. It increases permeability of the blood-brain barrier. It causes oxidative stress. So not in your bedroom, and not on the other side of the wall of your bedhead. So have a look around your bedroom. Make sure there's no baby monitors. Why are people using baby monitors? And no wireless devices like routers, extenders or boosters. They pump out high levels of radiation and they impact sleep over time. And not your mobile phone charged in your bedroom either. So there shouldn't be any of the following devices, because of the magnetic fields, within a metre of your bed. So having the fridge on the other side of the wall of your bed, having an oven that's in use or heating on the other side of the wall of a cot or a child's bed, big no, creates high magnetic fields. A meter panel, smart meters shouldn't be, within a room away from your bed. And of course, a bank of smart meters is the worst case scenario. Describe your symptoms. Do they match headaches, fatigue, palpitations, brain fog, poor concentration, poor memory, dyslexia, symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity? Do your symptoms improve when you get away from the electromagnetic fields? Well, that could be a sign. Do you experience relief when you have a bath? Epsom salt baths help a lot of patients with electrical sensitivities. So how do you reduce your exposure? I mentioned with the cell phone, use an earpiece. Text instead of calling, use a loudspeaker, use a corded phone, obviously best case scenario if you can, and of course to use in a good reception area is also important. Distance is your friend. The only thing that we know works well with electromagnetic field exposure is distance. So wherever the EMF devices, appliances are in your house, make sure you create a distance. As you double the distance away from the source, you effectively reduce your exposure by 75%. So no devices in your bedroom. I use a battery operated clock for my to wake me up in the morning, and that's it. No other devices in the bedroom. How to reduce your exposure from digital devices? Well, avoid using them at least an hour before bed. I would strongly suggest you don't use devices after sunset. Why? Because it suppresses melatonin, which keeps you up and makes it difficult for you to sleep, which of course has multiple downstream effects. Once you've downloaded the app, especially for children, put it in flight mode if you can. Place it on a table. Never place a digital device on your lap. Laptop is a dumb word for the device because the battery can often create a high magnetic field. Use a blue light filter if you must work into the night, especially adults. Use a blue light filter on your devices, and LEDs that emit high levels of blue light should be avoided. Don't charge any of your mobile devices in the bedroom, and obviously hardwire cable is always a much better option because they don't emit any radio frequencies at all. Router. Hardwired cable router, always the best option. But if you can't do that, then obviously turn it off at night when you're not using it. Turn it off when you're not using it at all. And don't turn it off at the router, because most of the dual band routers that we've tested emit high levels of radiation as a result of the switch mode power supply. So turn the router off at the wall, at the power point, not at the router, because you'll find that most of the new ones coming on the market emit high levels of RF even when you turn off their switch. Power it down so it doesn't actually emit over the entire house and the neighbour. When you get onto the manufacturer's website, you'll be able to have instructions on how you can reduce the radiation emitted from that router, so it's only emitting in 1 or 2 rooms in your house where you want internet connectivity. Avoid dual band modems because they emit very high levels of radiation, and of course, as I mentioned, turn it off when it's not in use, especially at night. For your smart meter, always best not to sleep in the room where the smart meter is located. It emits electric field, a magnetic field, and radio frequencies and high levels of dirty power, all of the fields. So can we shield this? Well, shielding paint will only reduce the radio frequency component. It will not shield magnetic fields, which is a problem. So if you can't get out of the room where the smart meter is, make sure you put the bed on the opposite wall to the smart meter to get away from the magnetic field, and then get shielding paints, which you can find on the internet, or contact a building biologist, on the wall to reduce the exposure to the radio frequencies. Get the power distributor. One of the best ways to reduce the radio frequency component rather than use paints is to actually contact the metering manager from your power distributor, not your retailer, and ask them to relocate the antenna away from the meter. And what they can do is put it on the roof, so it's away from the room where the smart meter is located, which means you're not going to have RF component at all, and that's probably the best option if you cannot relocate out of that room. Shielding paint will attenuate radio frequencies, but it won't get rid of it altogether. So don't continue to sleep on that wall where the meter panel is located. Dealing with patients who have electrical sensitivities, avoidance is really the only way, and a lot of them learn that the hard way. Hardwired cable options where you can. The bed canopy can be often the only relief that clients with electrical sensitivity have. Basically, it's shielded textiles. It's like a tent around the bed and under the bed in order to reduce their exposures to the radio frequency component to wireless devices. Shielded cable wiring is also very useful, but it's very expensive, at least 7 times more expensive than flat TPS used in conventional building wiring. And of course, frequent baths are also very useful. With people who are electrically sensitive, always check for mold and chemicals because often they are very much interlinked. Shielding materials do work at attenuating the electric field and radio frequencies, but they will have no impact on the magnetic field. So that's why you need a building biologist to assess this, or at least buy my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family, to get your head around the different fields and how to reduce their exposures. So shielding materials generally contain impregnated with either carbon and or metal ions such as silver and copper. So you can get textiles such as these. So there are fabrics like this that you can use, and you can actually get someone to sew them in behind your fabric curtains to reduce the exposures from an external source. So fabrics like this. You could also buy shielded caps and clothing to reduce your exposure if you're highly sensitive. You can also buy these metal, which can be used for fly screens. So on windows they can be used, or they could also be used in curtains, sewn into curtains to reduce your exposures, because most metals will reflect radio frequencies as well. The other one is wallpapers are actually quite effective at reducing exposures to the radio frequencies from, say, a smart meter. This could be used, say, for example, on a screen. So you could put any of these things onto a screen, a movable screen, and move it around the house based on creating a barrier between you and the exposure. So if you know the smart meter is there, just get a folded screen and hang these things around just to reduce your exposures temporarily, especially if you're in renting. That can often be a good idea. And of course I mentioned the shielded bed canopy. Personal devices. Are there any personal devices you can put on your cell phone or plug into your house to reduce your exposure? No. No, please don't go and buy hundreds or thousands of dollars worth of crap that actually makes no difference to our electromagnetic field meters. So when we go and test these, it makes no difference. And it gives people a false sense of security they're doing something. So if you buy something to put on your cell phone to reduce the radiation, I would ask you, can you still make or receive a call? And if the answer is yes, then it hasn't done anything. Now, when you talk to the manufacturers to these devices, they say, oh, it enhances your body's ability to deal with the frequency. That's rubbish, because it makes no difference. Now, maybe there is a mechanism by which it could improve their health, I don't know, but because they can't prove it, there's no biomarkers to test it, it can't be verified. So in my position, there's no way I can endorse products that make no difference to the readings of our meters. So I strongly suggest you don't go and buy all these ridiculous plugins and phone discs and crystals, because they don't make a difference. Ironically, the exception to that is shungite crystal. Now, shungite was mined initially in Russia, and it contains fullerenes, or it contains a carbon matrix of such that shields electromagnetic fields. But for it to work, say for example, here's the modem, I would have to have a shungite crystal to cover between me and the modem, to have any impact on reducing my exposure. So having a little crystal on your desk does bugger all. It needs to be as big as the shielding material. So if this is the device, you literally need to create a boundary between you and the device. And of course, to get a shungite crystal that big will probably cost you thousands and thousands of dollars, so it's useless. And of course, because it's mined in various parts of the world, we don't know the fullerene content of that crystal without testing it. So that's why I can't endorse crystals either. So be mindful, these devices do not attenuate, and the manufacturers acknowledge this, that it doesn't make any difference to the readings, but it improves your body's ability to deal with EMFs. Go figure. So how do we measure radio frequencies? Well, it's not all bad news. There are devices that you can use. If you can't afford a building biologist to come and assess your home, which is the best case scenario, you can get devices that are accurate, that are not overly priced. The devices we use, we spend about $6,000 on the instruments we use as building biologists, and 250 hours in the building biology course on how to use them. But there are devices that you can get if you live in a remote area and or you want to test it yourself. They include the safe and sound meters, as you can see here. Very simple and easy to use. You literally turn it on, and what I love about it is that it creates an effect, i.e. a traffic light effect. So it tells you instantly what the readings are, and you can see here moderate to high where I am right now as a result of all these devices. This measures radio frequencies, so that's important to know, and it tells you what levels this actually is. So that's the device if you want to get an accurate device, but it's a traffic light system, that's useful. If you want something more with a digital display, then this is the upmarket device for that, and actually gives you in microwatts per square metre, so you can compare it to the building biology standard. It's a bit more expensive, but it's under 1,000. How well worth getting if you want to do the measurements yourself. And as you can see, as a result of the devices nearby here, it's completely freaking out, as I am, so I'm going to hurry up. So that's this other device, Safe and Sound Pro, which provides digital readings, and it's accurate because we've compared it to our gigahertz meters. You can find these meters on buildingbiology.com.au, or if you're international, you can get it through the slt.co website. Now, the 5G frequency is currently being rolled out in Australia. We have low, medium and high. Low is less than a gigahertz. Medium is 1 to 6, and anything above 6, which could be up to 60 gigahertz. Now, at the moment, with the initial rollout of 5G in Australia, it is under 10 gigahertz, which is what our meters will be measuring, and what these devices will also be measuring. They measure up to 12 gigahertz. In the USA, they'll be using 600 megahertz, Asia Pacific 700, etc. This is based on the Commonwealth of Australia's recent report, 5G Enabling the Economy. So I would suggest you contact if you're in a different country, find out what frequency they're using to make sure the device you buy will measure that. Most importantly, if you can get a building biologist, electromagnetic field testing is really complicated because the building materials in your house, if you've got vapor barriers, metal vapor barriers, that will reflect a lot of the radio frequencies, which means if you have a metal roof, vapor barriers, etc., that's a problem because you've created a metal box that you're living in, and all your internal wireless devices will be bouncing back into your house. So that's something you need to be mindful of, which is why we spend 250 hours in the course. For more information or to get a building biologist, refer to our association, the Australasian Society of Building Biologists, at asbb.org.au. These are the type of devices we use. As I said, we're looking at about $6,000 to $7,000 that we spend on equipment, and more importantly, the 250 hours on how to use it adequately. So what can you do? In light of the evidence I've provided to show that we do actually need to act, well, that's simple. First, sign the petition in your country. In Australia, the Stop 5G petition link is here. There's also information on my website, buildingbiology.com.au. Lots of information on my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family. And I have a free Healthy Home newsletter which we prescribe every month on information related to health hazards in the built environment. My Facebook page, Nicole Bausma, also has a lot of data which will help you understand why you need to act, and more importantly, the simple steps you can take to act. Also, you may want to do the Healthy Home Survey. For more information, healthyhomesurvey.com will look at if there are health hazards in your home, look at your symptoms and see if there are correlations, and create a report to be able to identify this. Thank you so much.